The ballroom shimmered like liquid gold under the sway of countless crystal chandeliers, each drop of light trembling like the heartbeat of the city itself. London's finest had gathered in their silks and satins, the scent of roses and polished wood mingling with the faint tang of candle wax. Laughter echoed from one gilded corner to another, a delicate veneer stretched taut over the undercurrent of ambition, rivalry, and longing. In the center of this orchestrated brilliance stood Miss Eliza Whitcombe, her posture the very definition of restrained elegance, her hands folded lightly before her. Her gown, a modest ivory satin trimmed with pearl beads, whispered of refinement without ostentation. Each measured step she took across the marble floor seemed an act of courage, for though her heart was steady, her reputation was an unarmed target beneath the scrutinizing gaze of society. Eliza's eyes, pools of quiet intelligence, flickered from one conversation cluster to the next. She observed the society that enveloped her, its smiles polite, its gestures graceful, but she felt the subtle undercurrents of judgment like a draft through a window left ajar. Her mother's whispered instructions and gentle nudges toward advantageous matches had not hardened her, nor had the countless invitations she declined for the sake of propriety. She had long learned that dignity, even when wounded, could be the most potent form of defense. And yet, tonight, a chill brushed her spine, one that had little to do with the cold of the marble beneath her slippers. It was a premonition, a flutter of unease that she could not name but could feel in the marrow of her bones. Across the room, near the balcony doors, stood Lord Adrian Ashbourne, heir to one of the oldest and most formidable estates in England. His presence was a study in disciplined elegance, the dark lines of his tailcoat pressed to perfection, waistcoat polished, gloves clean and taut. His dark hair was combed back, though a slight rogue curl fell stubbornly over his forehead, defiant against the order he otherwise embodied. Adrian's gaze swept the ballroom with the precision of a man accustomed to command. When it paused upon Eliza, a subtle tightening of his jaw betrayed a stir of emotion he carefully masked beneath a veneer of indifference. He had known her at social gatherings before, had observed her wit and poise, and yet tonight something within her, the quiet resilience, the way her eyes refused to shrink from scrutiny, demanded more than casual acknowledgement. It demanded consideration, though he would not yet admit it to himself. A conversation of minor consequence stirred nearby, a gentleman discussing a fox hunt with exaggerated fervor, a lady responding with perfunctory enthusiasm, but Adrian's attention was elsewhere. He leaned toward a friend, his voice a low murmur, meant only for those closest to him. "She is amiable, yes, but unfit to be my wife." The words, so softly spoken, carried with them a weight that should not have traveled, yet they did. The echo of them, like a stone thrown into still water, rippled through the crowd. Polite whispers coalesced into audible murmurs, fans snapped shut, eyes darted toward Eliza, and laughter, polite yet pointed, brushed against the edges of her ears. The room's light seemed to dim, the chandeliers suddenly less brilliant, as if the very air had thickened with the venom of social judgment. Her mother, poised at her side, froze, cheeks paling as she understood what had been said, what had now become unavoidable. Eliza's heart thudded in her chest, a loud and accusing rhythm that she could not fully suppress, though she managed a composure that was nearly perfect. She did not crumble. She could not. Not here, not now. Every inch of her being had been trained to bear the weight of society's expectations, and yet the sting of betrayal cut deeper than she expected. The warmth of embarrassment and the chill of humiliation coiled together inside her, and she allowed herself a single infinitesimal pause, a held breath, before lifting her chin and moving away. Her steps were measured, deliberate, a silent assertion that dignity would not abandon her, even as whispers nipped at the edges of her cloak and gown. The music continued, the violins playing on, but for her, each note sounded slightly distorted, heavy with the knowledge that one careless phrase had set her world trembling. Outside, the courtyard awaited her, slick with rain that had begun in a fine, misting drizzle. The cobblestones glistened like scattered gemstones beneath the gaslight, each reflection trembling as if acknowledging her disquiet. She drew her shawl tightly across her shoulders, the damp pressing against the fine fabric, and allowed herself one solitary tear. It traced a path down her cheek with the quiet audacity of grief acknowledged but not displayed. The night air was brisk, sharp against her skin, yet it seemed to carry a strange solace, a sense that the world beyond the ballroom's gilded cage might offer clarity she could not yet see within it. Unbeknownst to her, Adrian noticed her absence almost immediately. His eyes, scanning the crowd moments before with practiced ease, now sought the form that had so unsettled him without his own admission. There was a moment, a breath suspended in space, where recognition mingled with regret. He understood at last the fragility of what he had dismissed. The consequences of a whisper, though subtle, could be monumental. Yet the veneer of control remained intact, and the ballroom's murmurs continued to drift through the gilded hallways, unaware of the inner tempest that had taken root. Eliza lingered beneath the stone archway, the rain falling gently around her, a quiet testament to the tension she now bore alone. She traced a fingertip along the cool stone, feeling the weight of a night that had begun with promise and ended in a kind of exquisite, unspoken pain. The world she had navigated with care and intelligence now felt distant, as if the chandeliers and the violins were part of another reality, one that had no place for the quiet strength that defined her. And yet, even in this moment of isolation, she felt the first stirring of a question she could not yet name, the tremor of curiosity about the man whose careless words had both wounded and awakened her in ways she could not yet articulate. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, through the mist and the flicker of gas lamps, she sensed a presence. Not yet seen, not yet acknowledged, but tangible in the air between heartbeats. The ballroom behind her held its laughter and judgment, yet here, in the solitude of rain and shadow, the promise of confrontation, revelation, and perhaps understanding lingered. Her gaze lifted toward the storm-tossed sky, and a shiver ran through her, not of fear but of anticipation. For while the whisper had marked her with public shame, it had also drawn a line across the night, one she knew would divide the world she had always known from the world she was only beginning to glimpse. And as the wind tugged at the edges of her gown, as the rain carved rivulets along the stones, she did not move, did not speak, but waited. Somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the whispers, the man who had spoken so carelessly might yet confront the consequences of what he had done, and the weight of that reckoning would be nothing short of profound. Weeks had passed since the ballroom incident, yet the echo of Adrian Ashbourne's careless words clung to Eliza Whitcombe like a shadow she could not shake. London's society moved on with the mechanical precision of a clock, but for her, every encounter, every polite nod or whispered greeting carried the weight of his judgment. Invitations that once sparked curiosity now felt like traps. Every smile from a prospective suitor was measured against the memory of his scorn. Her mother fretted over the visible shrinkage of her social prospects, yet Eliza maintained the poise of one accustomed to restraint. She had learned to carry humiliation with dignity, to absorb scandal as one might absorb the sting of a winter wind, with awareness and without surrender. It was on an afternoon washed with sunlight through the great windows of her mother's drawing room that the first token arrived. A simple delivery, almost imperceptible in its presentation. A small basket of pristine white camellias, tied with a ribbon of soft cream. Their fragrance was delicate, yet it carried a subtle insistence, a quiet insistence that they had not been sent by a friend, nor by a stranger. Eliza regarded them in silence, her gloved fingers brushing the petals with measured curiosity. She knew. She could not be mistaken. The gesture was hers alone to interpret, a silent overture that spoke louder than words. Her heart, so accustomed to careful restraint, stirred in ways both thrilling and infuriating. The camellias were an apology, a recognition, a challenge. Yet they arrived without explanation, leaving her suspended between hope and caution. She did not allow herself to linger too long, returning the flowers to their basket and placing them on the table, where they seemed to glow in the muted afternoon light. The act of sending them was audacious, yet it carried no guarantee of restitution. In that delicate ambiguity lay the tension that made her pulse quicken. That evening, a garden soirée unfolded at the residence of the Marchioness of Harrogate, the grounds illuminated by lanterns that flickered like fireflies trapped in glass. Eliza moved with practiced ease among the clusters of society ladies, her attention half occupied by the conversations around her and half occupied by the question that had taken root within her. Would he come? She did not imagine it aloud, did not allow her mind to dwell on desire that could betray her composure, yet a part of her could not deny the thrill of anticipation. He did appear. Adrian Ashbourne, composed as ever, his expression carefully moderated to convey civility without sentiment, approached her with measured steps. Each movement bespoke restraint, yet there was an unspoken urgency beneath the surface. He did not bow too low, nor did he linger in superficial pleasantries. He spoke softly, just above the murmur of the gathering, and yet his words seemed to vibrate against her very soul. "Miss Whitcombe, may I request a moment of your forgiveness?" There was no flourish, no declaration. The request was simple, almost austere, yet it carried the weight of acknowledgement, the recognition that the damage of a careless word was not easily undone. Eliza, ever conscious of the eyes that flickered between them, inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his presence without yielding to the vulnerability that lingered behind her calm exterior. She did not answer immediately, choosing instead to observe him, to measure the sincerity that radiated in the subtle tension of his hands, the slight narrowing of his eyes that betrayed internal struggle. Later that week, the scandal arrived in the most ordinary of circumstances. A carriage ride home, precipitated by a sudden and merciless rain, left Eliza stranded beneath the drizzle. Her shawl, damp against her shoulders, could not protect her entirely from the chill, and the streets shimmered with reflections of lantern light upon the wet cobblestones. Adrian appeared, as if summoned by the necessity of propriety, though she suspected the motive was more personal. "Miss Whitcombe, you must not walk unaccompanied," he said, his tone formal, but underlaid with concern that refused to be fully masked. "It would be unseemly and dangerous." She accepted the offered carriage with no word of thanks, for gratitude felt insufficient to express the quiet storm of emotions that had taken hold. Yet the act, public as it was, became fodder for the ever-hungry whispering society. By morning, the salons were alive with speculation, the gentlemanly concern, the shared carriage, the implied impropriety. And still she did not bend, did not beg for restoration. She walked her path with dignity intact, even as the subtle claws of rumor threatened to tear her carefully constructed reputation. In the privacy of her mother's drawing-room, she allowed herself a sigh that carried both frustration and a strange sense of satisfaction. The camellias had spoken, his presence had spoken, and society had spoken. Each had delivered a message, one of admiration, one of attention, and one of judgment. She felt the weight of these voices pressing upon her, yet she also felt a stirring of awareness that Adrian's gestures were deliberate, that the man who had once dismissed her with a single whisper was now compelled to act in ways that acknowledged his error. The evenings became a delicate dance of observation and interpretation. She noticed the subtle shifts in his approach, a brief glance across a crowded room, a carefully positioned conversation to pass her along the pathway, a measured phrase that carried both apology and an invitation to reconciliation. Each act, small and deliberate, was a challenge to her resolve, and each was a reminder of the peril inherent in allowing desire to mingle with wounded pride. Yet for all his attentions she maintained a wary distance. The garden paths, the lantern-lit walks, the quiet exchanges, each left her both elated and cautious. She had learned, in the hard way of whispered judgments, that no gesture, however sincere, could erase the past. Trust was not granted lightly, and she would not allow even the most subtle act of charm to weaken the shield she had constructed. And then came the evening when the world seemed to narrow into a single moment. She stood beneath a trellis of climbing roses, rain-slick petals glinting in the soft light of the lanterns, when Adrian approached with a carriage waiting at the edge of the garden. His expression bore the tension of a man balancing propriety with an unacknowledged urgency. He spoke, but not in the crowded hum of society. "It is not for the world's approval, Miss Whitcombe," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "that I act. It is for yours." She felt her pulse quicken, her breath caught in quiet recognition of the sincerity she could no longer doubt. The white camellias, the calculated appearances, the protective measures, they were not mere gestures. They were confessions, delicate yet undeniable, delivered in a manner that demanded discernment, not applause. Eliza's hand hovered over the carriage door, her mind a battlefield of pride and curiosity, when she realized that the evening, with its drizzle and lanterns and whispered promise, had altered the equilibrium. She could not yet forgive, could not yet trust, yet she understood that the man who had once declared her unfit was now attempting a careful redemption, one she could neither fully accept nor ignore. The carriage rolled slowly through the slick streets, the lamps reflecting in puddles like twin flames stretching into eternity, and somewhere in the private recesses of her heart, Eliza recognized that the game had changed. The scandal of shared space, the subtle intimacies of a man now willing to risk opinion for her presence, had created a tension both thrilling and dangerous. And as the wheels clattered against the cobblestones, she understood the unspoken truth. He would not relent, society would not relent, and she herself, for all her careful restraint, might find that her own heart was no longer willing to stand apart. A shadow of uncertainty, delicate yet potent, fell across the carriage interior as she lifted her gaze toward the rainy night beyond the glass. The white camellias rested upon her lap, their petals cool against her fingers, a silent witness to the unfolding game of pride, affection, and societal expectation. Somewhere in the muted glow of the street lamps, Adrian's presence loomed, deliberate and unyielding, and Eliza felt, for the first time, that the careful balance she had maintained might be upended, not by the world, not by gossip, but by the quiet insistence of a man who had once dismissed her entirely. The library at Ashbourne Estate was a sanctuary of amber light and muted shadows, each shelf of leather-bound volumes a silent witness to decades of lineage, ambition, and expectation. Rain streaked against the tall windows in unsteady lines, blurring the sprawling gardens beyond into an impressionist haze of green and gray. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, sending flickers of warmth across the polished oak floor, a delicate contrast to the storm that raged outside. In the center of the room, Eliza Whitcombe stood, her gloved hands folded lightly before her, the faint rustle of her ivory dress mingling with the whisper of pages as she perused a volume of poetry. Her presence was measured, poised, yet there was a tension in the set of her shoulders and the subtle bite of her lip that betrayed the careful control she maintained over her emotions. Adrian Ashbourne entered quietly, not announcing himself with the usual formality of a host but moving with an unusual restraint, as though each step were weighed against the gravity of the moment. His coat, dark and impeccably tailored, hung slightly damp from the rain, yet the composure of his bearing remained unshaken. In his eyes, shadows of regret flickered, reflections of sleepless nights spent pondering the consequences of his carelessness, of the casual whisper that had so gravely wounded her dignity. When his gaze fell upon Eliza, it was no longer the detached assessment of a man used to commanding attention, but something raw, unguarded, a plea hidden beneath the veneer of aristocratic control. "Eliza," he began, his voice low, careful, yet trembling ever so slightly with the weight of unsaid truths, "I must speak with you if only for a moment." The words seemed to carry across the room like the measured toll of a bell, drawing attention not from society but from the very air between them. She did not respond immediately, lifting her gaze slowly from the page she had not truly been reading, and met him with eyes that were steady, though they held the faint sheen of restrained emotion. She did not step back, she did not speak. She merely waited, allowing him the full measure of his own hesitation. He crossed the room with deliberate caution, his boots making the softest echo against the polished floor. He stopped just short of the rug where she stood, the firelight flickering across his sharp features, highlighting the tension in his jaw and the subtle furrow between his brows. "You must forgive me," he said finally, the words carrying both apology and confession. "Not for the world's sake nor for appearances but for mine. I have acted with the arrogance of a man blind to the consequences of his own pride." Eliza's lips pressed together, a line of fragile restraint. "And yet your actions have consequences, my lord," she said, her voice steady but quiet, carrying the weight of indignation and the echo of her hurt. "Words spoken carelessly do not vanish into the air. They remain, lingering as judgment long after they were intended. You spoke of my unworthiness before your friends, before your peers, and I have borne it with all the dignity I could muster." She paused, letting the firelight dance across her profile, illuminating the fine tension in her face. "Do you understand what that means? To stand accused without voice, to have the very air you breathe marked by another's disdain." Adrian's expression softened, the hardness of authority giving way to the tremulous vulnerability of a man who had at last confronted his own failure. "I do," he admitted, his voice scarcely above a whisper. "I have spent nights considering the gravity of my error, the cruelty of my words, and the depth of the wound I have caused. And yet I feared, foolishly, cowardly, that to admit the truth of my heart, to acknowledge my affection, would make me appear weak, unworthy of my station. In doing so, I have failed you and I have failed myself." Eliza felt the stirrings of something she had carefully restrained for weeks. Curiosity mingled with anger, anger with reluctant admiration. She did not move, did not soften her posture, yet the firelight seemed to warm her from within, illuminating the vulnerability that she had so carefully guarded. "And now," she asked, her voice measured, the slightest quiver betraying her inner conflict, "do you come to restore your reputation, or to offer the truth of your heart?" Adrian's gaze met hers with unflinching intensity. "I come to offer both," he said, and the admission was neither grandiose nor performative. It was simple, precise, a surrender to honesty long withheld. "I have loved you since the first conversation in which you challenged me, intellectually and morally, without knowing the effect it had on me. I have admired your strength, your integrity, your wit, and I have acted as a fool, allowing pride to silence what my heart has known for far too long." The room, heavy with the scent of rain and polished wood, seemed to still around them. Eliza felt her chest tighten, the careful composure she had maintained threatening to fracture. Yet she did not allow herself to yield entirely. She had learned the cost of trust and the peril of hope. She turned slightly, letting her gaze drift to the shelves, as if the centuries of literature lining the walls could provide her with counsel or reprieve. "And do you expect my forgiveness so readily?" she asked, a faint edge of steel in her voice. "Do you imagine that words alone can erase weeks of wounded dignity, of whispered judgments that have followed me like a shadow?" Adrian took a measured step closer, careful not to impose yet unable to restrain the pull toward her. "I do not expect forgiveness, Eliza. I seek only the opportunity to earn it, to show that my actions may yet align with my words. I have been a man of thoughtless pride, yet it is in humility that I now stand before you. Allow me the chance to prove that I am no longer the man who spoke without consideration, and perhaps, if you will permit it, that I may be worthy of your trust." Eliza's breath caught, the storm outside echoing the turmoil within her. She wanted to speak, to chastise, to demand assurances that went beyond the fragile sincerity of his confession, yet the weight of her own feelings made her pause. She had long held herself apart from romantic indulgence, believing prudence and dignity paramount, yet now, faced with the undeniable honesty of the man she had once regarded with suspicion, she felt the faint stirrings of a desire she could neither ignore nor fully embrace. "Words," she said softly, "carry weight. Actions will determine whether they hold truth. I will listen, I will watch, but I cannot yet promise acceptance." The edge in her voice softened slightly, just enough for Adrian to catch a glimmer of hope, though the barrier of prudence remained firmly in place. The fire crackled, sending sparks that danced like fleeting promises into the shadows. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the glass with a rhythm that mirrored the tension in the room. Adrian remained where he was, a figure of solemn determination, his eyes fixed on hers, silent in his plea. Eliza turned slightly toward the window, her reflection merging with the storm beyond, and for a single moment, the space between them felt suspended, fragile yet charged with the promise of revelation. And then, without a word, she left the library, her skirts whispering across the polished floor, leaving Adrian to the warmth of the fire and the weight of his own confession. The door closed softly behind her, and the room seemed to exhale, the lingering scent of rain and wood smoke holding the memory of truths now spoken, of hearts laid bare, and of a reckoning that had only just begun. The evening of the charity gala arrived with a soft haze of candlelight and the scent of roses, the grand hall of Ashbourne estate alive with polished manners and the hum of whispered speculation. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, catching the flicker of flame in the gilded mirrors that lined the walls. Ladies in gowns of sapphire, emerald, and blush moved with delicate grace, their laughter tinkling above the low murmur of polite conversation. Gentlemen, faces stern and well-mannered, offered compliments and bows with the precision of a carefully choreographed dance. In this glittering theater of propriety, Eliza Whitcombe moved with quiet dignity, her ivory satin dress catching the light as she passed through the crowd. Each measured step reflected a mind keenly aware of observation, yet she bore her past humiliation like armor, holding her head high even as whispers brushed the edges of her presence. Adrian Ashbourne entered with a deliberate restraint that drew eyes, though none dared remark upon the storm beneath his calm exterior. His dark tailcoat was immaculate, gloves polished, and posture unyielding, yet there was tension in his jaw, a subtle strain in his shoulders that betrayed the inner urgency he carefully concealed. He scanned the hall, searching, and when his gaze fell upon Eliza, it lingered, not in casual acknowledgment but in quiet, unspoken reckoning. The memory of his careless words, the weight of weeks of private longing and public consequences, pressed upon him as he advanced, each step measured against the judgment of a society that would not forgive impropriety, even in the name of passion. Eliza sensed him before he spoke, the air between them charged with an intensity that made the chatter fade to a distant hum. She did not turn immediately, allowing the moment to stretch, testing both their resolve. When she finally met his eyes, there was no need for pretense. The unspoken acknowledgment of past slights, of private glances and cautious gestures, filled the space between them. Adrian approached, hands lightly resting at his sides, the expression he bore neither arrogant nor timid, but entirely honest in its vulnerability. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, voice low yet resonant over the soft music, "I will not ask for your forgiveness in whispers nor in shadows. Tonight, in full view of all, I must speak as I should have spoken long ago." Her heart quickened, a tremor that she fought to suppress. She had anticipated this, feared it even, yet the reality struck her with a force that left her momentarily breathless. The guest's eyes followed the pair with polite curiosity, but the moment seemed suspended from time, as if the chandeliers themselves held their breath. "I have been a man of careless words," Adrian continued, stepping closer, the polished floor echoing faintly beneath his boots, and pride that shielded me from truth. I spoke of your unworthiness once, and in doing so, I condemned not you, but my own heart to cowardice. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle like the scent of rain on dry earth. It was never society's judgment I feared, only the exposure of what I truly felt. I have loved you, Eliza, from the moment you first challenged me, with courage and wit beyond the measure I believed a woman of grace could command. And yet I hesitated, and in hesitation, I allowed a cruel whisper to stain your honor. A faint gasp swept the hall, subtle yet undeniable, as society sensed the deviation from convention. Eliza felt her pulse drum against her ribs, a mixture of astonishment, anger, and an unbidden flicker of hope. She had maintained her restraint, her dignity, through weeks of scandal, yet this act, this declaration, pierced through the carefully maintained armor. She lifted her chin, measured and deliberate, and regarded him with eyes both steady and questioning. "Do you imagine words alone can repair what was wounded?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with the steel of years of prudence. "Do you believe that a public admission can undo the weeks of whispered slights, of judgment, of expectation betrayed?" Adrian's gaze softened, revealing vulnerability beneath the stoicism he had so long maintained. "I do not presume to erase the past," he replied, each word deliberate, carrying the full weight of his sincerity. "But I do intend to bear the consequences of my folly openly, without concealment. I will not retreat behind walls of pride. I will stand before society and admit what I have failed to honor privately, that you are deserving of every respect, every consideration, and of my heart, should you choose to grant it." The hall was silent now, the chandeliers casting a golden net over the gathered guests, their polite curiosity replaced with attentive awe. Eliza's mind raced, measuring the sincerity of his confession against the vulnerability she glimpsed, the courage required to declare such truth in a room where every word was examined, every gesture dissected. She had long relied on her judgment, on her restraint, yet now, confronted by the magnitude of his honesty, she felt the fragile stirrings of desire tempered by caution. A sudden shift in the room's energy drew her attention. A figure she had not anticipated, a prospective suitor long regarded as stable and respectable, approached with measured courtesy. His presence was a reminder of reality, of the social structures that demanded conformity and careful negotiation of propriety. Eliza's heart tightened. She realized with a quiet ache that choice was no longer abstract. It demanded a decisive step, a moment of courage or concession. Adrian's hand extended slightly, not in command, but in earnest entreaty, a bridge across weeks of tension, scandal, and unspoken longing. "Eliza," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying through the charged silence of the room, "if pride remains between us, I will meet it. But know this, it was never you who was unfit, only I who failed to deserve you." She felt her resolve waver, the measured composure she had maintained now threatened by the raw power of his declaration. Her pulse rose, mingling fear with exhilaration, admiration with reluctant acknowledgement of a heart long constrained by propriety. She wanted to speak, to yield, to grant relief to the tension that had bound them both, yet the world waited, the eyes of society and expectation pressing upon her like invisible chains. For a heartbeat, time hung suspended, the firelight dancing across their faces, the chandeliers trembling with reflected brilliance, the storm outside mirrored in the torrent of emotion between them. And then, in a gesture both deliberate and devastating, she withdrew, her skirts whispering against the polished floor, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the nearest table. She offered no word, no concession, only the measured acknowledgement that she had heard, that she had considered, and that she would not yet surrender to the desires she had long buried. Adrian remained, standing beneath the brilliance of the chandeliers, a figure of solemn resolve, the echo of his confession lingering in the charged air. Around them, society whispered anew, unaware of the private reckoning that had transpired in plain view. The candles flickered, the music resumed its polite rhythm, yet the memory of his words, and the weight of her silent judgment, would endure. Outside, the rain continued its relentless descent, tracing paths along the windows as if mirroring the turbulent currents within their hearts. Adrian's eyes followed her retreating form, recognizing the distance that remained, yet refusing to relent. In that charged silence, both understood the truth. Reconciliation would demand courage, patience, and a reckoning with pride. And the moment had arrived when every choice, every gesture, every word would carry consequences neither could yet fully measure. The morning air was brittle with a faint promise of frost, the gardens of the Whitcombe estate shivering beneath a thin veil of mist. The world seemed hushed, as though holding its breath for what was to come. Eliza Whitcombe walked along the stone path, her gloves snug around her hands, her ivory gown brushing against the dew-laden grass. Each step was measured, deliberate, carrying her toward a future she had long tried to ignore, an arranged, respectable marriage to a widower of steady manners and predictable wealth. Her heart, however, carried the memory of another man, the one whose careless words had wounded her and whose gestures had awakened a longing she could not deny. Inside the house, the rooms were quiet, the scent of polished wood mingling with a faint aroma of lilacs brought in for the occasion. Her mother fussed with lace and ribbons, though her eyes frequently darted toward Eliza, worry etched into every line of her face. The reality was inescapable. Society expected the match to proceed, and Eliza had no choice but to comply. Yet beneath her calm exterior, her thoughts were a storm. The memory of Adrian Ashbourne's declaration, the firelight, the tremor of vulnerability, the unwavering honesty, haunted her with relentless persistence. She wondered if pride would prove a chain stronger than love, if caution would outweigh desire, if she would ever forgive herself for what her heart already knew. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, pattering gently against the stone and glass, turning the garden paths into rivers of reflection. She paused at the threshold, glancing toward the horizon where the Ashbourne estate rose in distant shadow. A sudden carriage clatter, muffled by the mist, drew her attention, and before her mind could settle, Adrian appeared. He rode with urgency, cloak damp, hair clinging slightly to his brow, eyes fixed entirely upon her. There was no pretense in his approach, no careful calibration for appearances. It was raw, immediate, and wholly unrelenting. "Eliza." His voice cut through the morning hush, a note of desperation threading through the formal tone he usually maintained. She did not move, did not speak. Her pulse quickened, her breath caught in quiet anticipation, and yet her dignity remained unyielding. He dismounted swiftly, boots crunching against the frost-bitten gravel, and approached her with measured yet insistent steps. "You cannot go through with this," he said, each word deliberate, weighted with an urgency that commanded attention without anger. "Not without hearing the truth of my heart one last time." She turned fully now, facing him with a calm that belied the tremor in her chest. "My lord," she said softly, "the time for private words has passed. The world watches, and I have obligations I cannot ignore." "And yet," he countered, closing the distance, "the world has never mattered." "Not truly. It is your heart, Eliza, that I have long feared to affront, and I can no longer remain silent while you step into a life of measured compromise instead of one of genuine devotion." The rain intensified, drumming against the carriage roof and pooling along the stone paths. Eliza felt a shiver, not of cold, but of anticipation. She had long prided herself on restraint, on dignity preserved in the face of scandal, yet here he was, defying expectation, risking reproach, and declaring the truth she had feared to hear. "I acted as a fool," Adrian continued, voice low, resonant, carrying across the empty gardens. "I spoke without thought, I withheld the truth of my heart, and I allowed pride to govern my every decision. You were never unfit, Eliza. You were always more than worthy, more than I dared hope to deserve. And now I beg you listen, for this may be the only moment left to set matters right." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. The wisdom of her upbringing warned caution, yet the stirrings of a long-suppressed longing pressed insistently against the barriers of prudence. "Words alone cannot undo what has been done," she said, each syllable careful, deliberate, a thin shield against the vulnerability threatening to overwhelm her. He took a step closer, hand extended, not to command but to entreat. "Then allow my actions to speak. Allow me to prove that my devotion, though delayed, is unwavering. I will not let propriety dictate the course of my heart any longer. I will stand by you, shield you, honor you, if you will permit me. Choose not for the world, Eliza. Choose for yourself and for us before circumstance denies us forever." The clouds above parted briefly, sunlight breaking through the mist in sharp beams that illuminated the frost-laden paths and glinted off his wet cloak. In that fleeting brilliance, she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability of a man stripped of pretense, the intensity of someone who had recognized the depth of his own error. Her heart, long restrained, stirred with undeniable force, a wave of longing tempered by the careful logic that had governed her life until now. Before she could respond, the carriage of the widower arrived, wheels crunching against the frost-hardened gravel. The figure of the man she was to wed appeared, measured and composed, a symbol of security and social propriety. The contrast could not have been more stark. One man, bound by society's expectations, steady but distant. the other reckless with vulnerability, alive with unrestrained emotion and wholly devoted. Eliza's pulse thundered in her chest as she weighed the two futures before her. Her hand hovered over the carriage door, a decision suspended between duty and desire. Adrian's gaze never wavered, steady, pleading, the weight of weeks of longing and regret carried in the intensity of his presence. "I cannot," she began, her voice faltering despite her best efforts. "You can," he interrupted gently, stepping closer, the warmth of his intention brushing against the chill of the morning. "You can because it is not too late to choose the life that calls to your heart, rather than the life expected of you. I have loved you through pride, through error, through silence. I am here now, unshielded, offering all that I am, all that I have, and all that I hope to be." The carriage wheels ground to a slow stop, a mechanical punctuation to the tension that had wound itself tightly around them. The widower waited, unaware of the tempest that had erupted, his presence a silent reminder of the obligations Eliza could not ignore. Yet, as she looked at Adrian, as the rain cast prisms of light upon his determined face, she knew that any step taken without the acknowledgement of her heart would be a step toward regret eternal. A trembling sigh escaped her lips, a subtle release of months of tension, fear, and longing. She stepped forward, not toward the carriage, but toward the man whose presence had transformed every calculated expectation she had ever held. In that movement, measured yet resolute, she spoke the truth that had lain dormant beneath weeks of caution. "Adrian," she whispered, voice breaking slightly, The world seemed to halt. Rain fell in soft torrents around them, the mist swirling like spirits of fate. And then, in a sudden, cruel twist of inevitability, she faltered, gripping the railing for support, a faint pallor crossing her face. A fever, sudden and overwhelming, seized her body and she staggered, caught only by his outstretched hands. Adrian's face went white with terror, his arms closing around her as he steadied her, his heart pounding not with social pride but with uncontainable fear. "Eliza, stay with me," he cried, his voice raw, carrying over the mist and the distant clatter of the carriage. She clung to him, breath shallow, eyes wide, the vulnerability of the moment laying bare every hidden sentiment, every buried longing. The world contracted to the small space between them, the warmth of his hands against hers, the echo of the heartbeat that had carried both regret and hope, and the fragile life that trembled beneath his protective gaze. Every ounce of pride, every measure of restraint, fell away in the gravity of this singular moment. And as the mist thickened and the rain fell harder, Adrian realized, with a horror that pierced to the core, that the reconciliation he had longed for, the confession he had risked society to deliver, might now arrive too late. Her pulse fluttered faintly against his chest, a delicate and terrifying reminder that time, circumstance, and fate could never be undone.